they can regenerate their central nerve cord. Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and central nervous system disorders following strokes. Cures for all of these afflictions are challenged by the fact that regeneration of neurons in the mammalian spinal cord has not been possible. But these sea cucumbers have amazing regenerative properties that could serve as model systems for understanding how we can get a nervous system to regenerate. Just an example, a couple examples of the diversity of life and how it's directly connected not just to our well-being today, but to opportunities for improving human health in the future. So the example of the sea cucumber is sort of where biomedicine meets biomimicry. This is a relatively new science that uses inspiration from the diversity of life to solve engineering problems, like how do we reduce the resistance of the flow of air or water over surfaces? Well, nature has figured that out. Or how do we create materials that are both light and incredibly strong? Well, nature has figured that out through bones and tree trunks. So biomimicry is an active way of looking for inspiration from nature to solve real-world engineering problems. And here is a new engineering inspiration with an ultra cool name, the diabolical ironclad beetle. This beetle can withstand the crushing force of almost 40,000 times its own body weight. It turns out that there are microstructures in the beetle's armor that basically make it impossible to squish. This fly-through animation of the abdomen of the diabolical ironclad beetle, which is generated from tomographic data, it's showing 3 types of microstructures that create its armor. One that is interdigitated, one that is latching, and one that is freestanding. And the layers can like crackle and separate individually without the entire shell breaking at once. And a common engineering issue is that the point at which any 2 plates of any material join together is often the weakest. And as you can see in the bottom right image, the beetle has solved this with this interlocking pattern of jigsaw pieces. This is just so incredibly cool. And this type of strength against impacts and resistance to shattering would be incredibly useful in engineering things like body armor or buildings or bridges or aircraft. But body armor would be pretty cool. Beetles represent the greatest diversity of any group of animals. There are more than 340,000 species that have been described worldwide, including nearly 30,000 species just in North America. And because of this incredible diversity, we don't know that much about their conservation status, but of those beetles that have documented population trends, over 60% of them are known to be declining. Biodiversity is the fabrics in the clothes on our back. It's the sheets of the bed in the bed that we sleep in. It's the padded comfort of the rugs that we're walking on. I mean, plants and animals are providing these materials that we rely on every single day. Biodiversity from forests provides the wood and the thatch that frames the buildings that we live in or the paper products that we use. I mean, we rely on biodiversity every day in so many ways without necessarily acknowledging it. But the value of biodiversity does not just lie in its direct benefits of food or medicine or materials, or even some of the indirect benefits like the ecosystem service we described of pollination. Species actually shape their environment. Many species are ecosystem engineers that cause physical state changes in their environment, either directly or indirectly affecting the availability of resources to other species. That is, species modify, maintain, and create habitats. So in this desert landscape, there are species that dig holes that become wells where willows and cottonwoods germinate, serving as nurseries for desert trees. Uh-oh, Yeah.
You're fine, Healy. You're fine.
Okay.
Everything's moving.
Everything. All right. Thank you. It looks like the screen, just want to make sure the right screen is still showing. Thank you. So equids, horses and their relatives, are actually able to engineer desert water availability by digging wells. And in doing so, they create oases that in turn support this huge array of other wildlife. Over 3 summers, there were camera traps set up at 4 sites in the Sonoran Desert and at 1 site in the Mojave to observe these equids bioengineering their surroundings. And what we saw is that these holes that fill with water end up being oases. They're boons to wildlife. Badgers and black bears and birds, including declining species such as the elf owls showed up, and scrub jays and other mammals like mule deer and bighorn sheep and badgers, and even Colorado river toads. So almost 60 species came to these wells to drink. And so the species richness at the wells was over 60% higher than at the control sites, showing that these animals are intentionally visiting these equine-made wells. So the desert is actually being shaped and formed by these ecosystem engineers. Donkeys and horses are very capable diggers, and they can shovel sand and gravel backwards with their front hooves, but they're not the only species that exhibit this behavior. It's found across the world with both native and introduced feral animals. We've really just begun to understand the extent to which biodiversity shapes the world around us. And examples of ecosystem engineering is not only found on land, right, but also in the oceans. And perhaps the greatest example is coral reefs. This is just one section of the Great Barrier Reef, which is the single biggest structure made by living organisms in the world, 300,000 square kilometers across, composed of and built by billions of tiny coral polyps. So just to recognize that our planet has been physically shaped by the diversity of life in ways that most of us don't fully appreciate. And in an era of rapid global change, we're finding that many ecosystems are far more valuable than previously understood. We knew seagrass beds help buffer coastlines by absorbing the impact of storm surge. And we knew they provide habitat for many commercially important marine species. But they also remove carbon from the atmosphere way faster than tropical rainforests. And even though they cover less than 1/5 of 1% of the seafloor, they're responsible for about 10% of the carbon uptake from the ocean. Mangroves are also natural carbon scrubbers. They remove CO2 from the atmosphere and stash it away in their rich soils. Their underwater labyrinth root structure are ideal fish nurseries. They have fast-growing above-ground wood biomass that's used for construction and firewood, and they're also good ecosystems for beekeeping and producing honey. It's like the closer that we look, the more we understand that the natural world, in all of its genetic and chemical and biological and ecological diversity, in its interactions and processes, and in all of its beauty and fragility, nature is the key to our own well-being as individuals, as families, as communities. So how we manage the natural world will determine the future quality of life on Earth. And that's the theme for the rest of my talk. How will we manage the natural world to protect what is left and to restore what is degraded? To do this, I want to demonstrate just how much place-based data, spatial data, is essential. So here's some elephants in Africa. And because we live in the era of the Anthropocene, this fate of nature, including these elephants, which I hope I have convinced you now is inextricable to our own fate, the fate of nature will be decided by our actions. So I want to dive into this science of conservation with the unprecedented data and tools that we have to inform our actions, to determine which places are the most important to protect, and to figure out how to minimize the competition for resources that we see here between people and wildlife. And why does this topic deserve to be the headline of the 2021 Esri Science Symposium? Just because, right, the answer to these questions is largely spatial in nature. So this is one example shown by the animated tracks of 3 bull elephants, Imara, Uzima, and Tumaini, in Laikipia, Kenya. Using spatial data and technology, the NGO Space for Giants is confronting the conflict that was created by human settlement encroaching on what was sparsely settled areas. And so they fit the elephants with collars carrying chips linked to satellites, mapped their movement, and figured out which areas have the highest densities to create a solution that allowed for people and elephants to coexist. So how will we manage the natural world to protect what's left, to restore what is degraded? To answer this, we have to assess and map humanity's influence across the Earth. And thanks to powerful computing, to a network of Earth observing satellites, and new bottom-up census and crowdsourced data, our ability to do this has greatly evolved. So here we're looking at cumulative pressure maps that combine remotely sensed and ground-based observation data that are increasingly used to spatially assess a wide range of human pressures, seen here in the stack on the left. These approaches facilitate the mapping of Earth's remaining wilderness, right? We can identify those pressures, acquire or develop data on those individual pressures, assign relative pressure scores to individual pressures, and then stack them up, analyze them, and overlay them. That allows us to facilitate the mapping of Earth's remaining wilderness, improve estimates of extinction risks, help us monitor the status of existing protected areas, and to guide decisions about where new protections will be effective at conserving biodiversity. So the results of human footprint analyses are pretty sobering in their reality, but I hope also motivating in their sense of urgency. Here we're looking at pie charts of most of the major terrestrial ecosystems where the size of the circle relates to the aerial extent on the surface of the terrestrial Earth of that ecosystem. And red to light green to dark green shows the extent of human modification, with the dark green being what's left of intact wilderness, according to this analysis. So they provide, though, a spatially explicit understanding of the state of human pressure on the natural environment. And they're emphasizing the need to protect what's left of intact wilderness, but also the need and the importance and the opportunity to restore what has been modified. If we peer more closely into those data, they demonstrate the importance of existed protecting areas. So you can see here how Mount Kenya World Heritage Site shows up as an island of green, an island of intactness, surrounded by varying degrees of landscape modification by humans. Protected areas are a foundational tool in conserving biodiversity. I would love to point you to the Protected Planet report that came out last year. It comes out every couple years to help us answer the question, how are we doing in protecting life on our planet? So led by the United Nations Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Protected Areas, this year, the report is a beautifully produced live, all digital assessment that is filled with maps and spatial analyses, not just about where protected areas have been established, but also how well do they represent the diversity of Earth species and ecosystems, and how effectively are they being managed, and how isolated or connected they are. So I really encourage you to check out the Protected Planet report. And inside that report, it's an interesting year because we are now recognizing that there are communities and cultures that can effectively conserve biodiversity in situ outside of the Western concept of parks and protected areas. So there's been an increasing effort to recognize and map what are called OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures, such as a locally managed marine area that is effectively protected to support fish stocks, but may not have formal recognition as a protected area. So this is a welcome and inclusive and necessary shift in our understanding of what do we mean by conservation and what do we mean by protection. Systems of governance and management that deliver effective biodiversity conservation, no matter how formal or informal they are, need recognition. And this year's Protected Planet Report is beginning to provide that recognition. The conservation community has made great strides recently in developing standardized approaches to how we identify and delineate the places that are the most essential for the persistence of biodiversity. Key biodiversity areas are built on more than 30 years of experience in identifying important sites for different taxonomic, ecological, and thematic subsets of biodiversity. I mean, previously, we had sort of a wide diversity of approaches for defining what was important to conserve that actually undermined our conservation goals. I mean, we had biodiversity hotspots and important bird areas and Alliance for Zero Extinction sites and important plant areas and prime butterfly areas and even important fungus sites. And pretty soon, almost everywhere was an important area for conserving some element of biodiversity to somebody. And so the key biodiversity area standard, which was launched at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016, it was 10 years and hundreds of consultations in the making. And it brings a set of standardized criteria to the identification of important sites for biodiversity. And while we're still far from a complete assessment of key biodiversity areas in terrestrial, marine, and freshwater realm, collectively, these sites represent the most rigorous aggregated data set that yet exists on the areas that are critical for conserving the diversity of life. So this supports national governments and multinational corporations and international developments and conservation investors. All of them can evaluate their activities and develop their priorities using this information as a guide in their decision making. So here are a few major recent global biodiversity assessments that are built on data that are developed from local and national and regional and global scale data sets, using observation data, using remotely sensed data, and ecological modeling, among other tools. They help us understand what has happened to the natural world in this time of intense change. Over the past 50 years, the human population has doubled, the global economy has grown nearly fourfold, and global trade has grown tenfold, which is driving extraordinary demand and increasing demand for energy and materials. These assessments clearly tell us that our demands, to the extent that they have been met, which we know is inequitable across the planet, these demands are coming at an enormous cost to the natural world. How do we reduce those costs? How do we leverage data and technology and networks to reduce the conflict between conservation and development? So basically, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on how NatureServe is approaching the answers to those questions here in the United States. So we're going to go back in time to the beginning, to the birth of a movement. So Earthrise, this photograph taken over 50 years ago, is probably the most influential environmental photo that was ever taken. It's the first time that we saw our little blue marble from space and sort of recognized how fragile and delicate and unique it is in the known universe. So this photo inspires an environmental awareness movement of a nation that is seeking clean water and pure air and to sustain its magnificent natural heritage of wildlife and wild places. And so in 1970, we have Earth Day demonstrations. the demands of millions, over 20 million people that participated in the first Earth Day. They drive legislation for clean air, for clean water, for the protection of imperiled species via the Endangered Species Act, which gets signed into law by President Nixon in 1973. And it creates a mandate for the federal government to protect and recover species that are at risk of extinction. And I have to, I look at this photograph and these crowds and these posters, and it's kind of amazing. It's almost like a time warp, because we could have that exact same type of protest today. So suddenly, conservation scientists are faced with the need to answer some fundamental questions about biodiversity if the Endangered Species Act is going to be properly implemented. Fundamental questions like, how do we know what species in what places are actually at risk? So in 1974, the Nature Conservancy, sort of recognizing this need to discover and document and understand biodiversity at the scale of a nation in order to protect and conserve it, the scientists at the Nature Conservancy conceive of a network of natural heritage programs in every state that are designed to answer the fundamental questions about what species exist, where they are found, and how they are doing. And so TNC started establishing natural heritage programs beginning with South Carolina and Mississippi in 1974. And each of those programs is dedicated to systematically inventorying native species, documenting their distributions in the field, and determining their conservation status. The world's first biodiversity information network is born. And the network quickly grows throughout the US and spread into Canada and some partnerships in Latin America, where those programs are called conservation data centers, to become a Western Hemisphere biodiversity information network. And this is a network now called the NatureServe Network, since we spun off in 2000 as an independent organization. The NatureServe Network records and compiles and analyzes and shares the highest quality scientific information we have at scale on what species and ecosystems are present, where they occur, how they are doing, and what we can do to conserve them. So from the beginning, from its inception, the NatureServe Network has developed and shared methods, standardized methods for its observation and assessments of species and ecosystems. And since its earliest days, the network has pioneered technological advances in biodiversity data management. So we've been able to, since the beginning, use these shared data standards and these data management tools to allow us to seamlessly aggregate information, in this case, at the scale of our nation. In 1993, the first aggregated view across the network at that time, looking at the network data to understand the status and species of data across these jurisdictions, right? The network publishes perspectives on species imperilment. It's analyzing the role of public lands in sustaining threatened and endangered species, and it is only possible because of the network-wide shared data and standards, the methodologies, and the computerized information management systems that are part of our DNA since the beginning. So the data that is collected by natural heritage programs is not just focused on charismatic vertebrates like birds and mammals and amphibians. This chart again shows aggregated data here in the US for the conservation status of specific taxonomic groups. So NatureServe conservation status assessments have been conducted on tens of thousands of species, including bees and butterflies and freshwater mussels and crayfish and almost 20,000 plant species. So the combined red and orange and yellow are species whose conservation status are at various levels of risk, while the blues represent groups that are more secure. And that vertical red line depicts our best estimate of the percentage of each group that is at risk. And if you see that line at the top for all species, it's a third of all species that we have assessed are facing some kind of risk. This is information that we only can discover, share, and act on because of 50 years of standard data and management by NatureServe and its network programs. So this information is only useful if they're accessible. And over 20 years ago, we started doing that. We launched NatureServe Explorer, which is a free online encyclopedia of life. And it gives the public access for the first time to NatureServe's vast data on species and ecosystems. And last year, we redesigned it. So we now have a far more modern and functional NatureServe Explorer, which we invite you to explore. So that's a brief history and purpose of how our data and our network and our biodiversity information management systems were born and have evolved. And so here we are. This slide says 2020 because that's what the data represents on it. I do know it's 2021. So it's 2021, right? So for over nearly 50 years, our network has amassed over 1 million mapped locations of species populations with a focus on those that are rare and imperiled. And these data, as unique and as valuable as they still only represent our collective opportunity and whatever resources were available for actually sampling biodiversity on the ground in nature. They are incomplete. They're incomplete. But decisions about conserving the diversity of life are spatial in nature. We have to find ways to improve the coverage and the resolution of our understanding of one of the most fundamental of all conservation questions. Where do imperiled species exist? So we are leveraging data and technology and people to answer that question. So I'm going to jump straight into a practical real-world example from Texas, a state actually that has a lot of rare and imperiled species, both aquatic and terrestrial, yet a very limited extent of protected areas and almost exclusively private land. Conservation in Texas is going to happen mostly on private land, so it's got to be smart. It's got to be targeted. So these are planned road construction or road widening projects that are on the books in the Texas Department of Transportation over the next few years. These guys look like they're going to be pretty busy. And here is this beautiful, rare, and highly endangered neotropical migratory songbird, the aptly named golden-cheeked warbler. Its only habitat in the US is juniper oak woodlands in central Texas. It's actually the only bird that occurs in the US whose range is restricted to the state of Texas. So there's a lot of incentive to conserve this species. It has the full weight of the US Endangered Species Act behind it because it is federally listed as endangered. So this kicks in a lot of regulations for anyone, including the Department of Transportation, who wants to undertake activities that could potentially impact this beautiful little warbler. But if you want to know where it occurs during the breeding season, which is when it's found in Texas, if you look at bird range maps or at the US Fish and Wildlife Service website, you get a map covering a huge swath of central Texas. The map on the left with the bright blue dots, that represents the confirmed occurrence records from the Texas Natural Diversity Database, which is the NatureServe network program in Texas. These observations, they're made by qualified experts. They're called element occurrences, which are spatially explicit delineation of areas known to be of importance for the persistence of the golden-cheeked warbler. Not just any old observation, right? But high quality and of conservation value. But here's the issue, right? These element occurrences are the highest confidence records we have, but we know they are an underrepresentation. We never have the opportunity or the resources to conduct comprehensive field surveys that can identify all the golden-cheeked warbler habitat, especially not in Texas. So more commonly, we use what's on the right here, coarse range maps or county boundaries in jurisdiction where the species is known or suspected to occur, this map on the right. But we definitely know this is over-predicting the distribution of our target species. Habitat is almost never suitable throughout the entire range represented by these broad range maps. And yet, These two maps represent the two approaches that are the most widely used data inputs for our spatial conservation analyses, for our management decisions, for inventories in the field or mitigation efforts for road construction projects. But if we're going to be effective and efficient about identifying conservation actions, if we're going to find ways to reduce conflicts with infrastructure or agriculture or other land uses, we need to drastically improve the precision of our spatial data for species at risk. Today, we can defensively do exactly that by leveraging NatureServe's history of high quality species occurrence records, by embracing modern tools of predictive modeling, by accessing increasingly available high resolution data characterizing the environment, and by leveraging advances in data science and cloud computing, we can defensively dramatically improve our precision in this understanding. So for any species, like the golden cheek warbler, we can combine the verified occurrences in the map on the left with the suite of environmental conditions that occur in those places. And we can use machine learning to produce a map of where else in the environment that combination of conditions occur. So here on the right, the yellow to red map is a spatially explicit hypothesis of the distribution of habitat that is suitable for the warbler, where the more highly suitable habitat is in red and lower suitability is in yellow. We can then threshold that output to produce a high resolution map of the areas of highest probability of suitable habitat for the warbler. So now, instead of using our original approaches on the left, right, either only the confirmed records in blue or the big broad range map in beige, which we know are likely to either underrepresent or overrepresent species distributions, we have a high resolution, reproducible, like well-documented, testable spatial hypothesis that helps us refine our understanding of where any given imperiled species may occur. So we can now go back to the Texas Department of Transportation construction plans with a far more precise understanding of where transportation infrastructure and endangered warblers might actually be in conflict. And as it turns out, compared to a broad range map, there is a lot less conflict that's likely than would otherwise be anticipated. And where there is conflict, we can focus our resources appropriately. The new maps can help guide ground survey efforts. They can identify options for avoiding warbler habitat. They can direct Department of Transportation to the agencies or the landowners that might be partners in mitigating any adverse impacts. This kind of spatial precision can inform the balancing act that we face between conservation and economic development. And so, as some of you may have heard in previous talks that NatureServe has had the honor of giving at ESRI conferences, NatureServe is fully embracing the integration of our 50 years of high quality imperiled species records with spatial data on the environment, modern ecological modeling approaches, and cloud computing. So with support from ESRI, support and partnership with the Nature Conservancy, with Microsoft, and with experts all across our network with those natural heritage programs throughout the US, we've produced a suite of national analyses that we call the Map of Biodiversity Importance, or MOBI for short, by developing these individual habitat models for a very diverse taxonomic suite of over 2,200 imperiled species. And then we've aggregated and analyzed these data to reveal spatial patterns of imperiled biodiversity at unprecedented taxonomic and spatial resolution. The Map of Biodiversity Importance, or MOBI, is actually a series of 15 maps in all. There's 3 different spatial analyses for 5 different taxonomic groups. So this map is called range size rarity, and it's analyzed for all 2,216 species. This analysis, the range size rarity analysis, it places greater weight on imperiled species with narrower ranges because those small ranges translate to fewer opportunities for conservation interventions. So the brighter orange to yellow areas indicate where modeled habitat for multiple narrow range endemic species occurs. I can show you what it looks like zoomed in. This is a species richness map for aquatic invertebrates in the southeastern US. And here, the brighter the yellow, the brighter individual stream reaches, the higher the imperiled species diversity based on the MOBI analyses. So you might not spend a ton of time thinking about the importance of the conservation of crayfish or freshwater mussels, but actually the southeastern US is globally significant for its diversity of freshwater invertebrates. And if they are essential parts of the aquatic food chain. If you like fishing, you need to care about these critters. They help maintain water quality, they cycle nutrients, and as a group, they are the most imperiled element of biodiversity in our country. They've suffered the most extinctions, and almost half of remaining species are at risk. So the MOBI maps, all 15 of them, are freely available on the Living Atlas, where I just checked last night. They've been accessed over 25,000 times, which is pretty good for biodiversity maps. And they're being used right now by organizations like the Pew Charitable Trusts, by the Nature Conservancy, by the electric power industry to guide land management and conservation investment decisions. And let me just clarify how much of an advance this is. So the first map that came out was the Biodiversity Hot Spot Map that we had generated previously. That was NatureServe's most in-demand aggregated data product. And it was the best we could do analyzing the aggregated element occurrences at that point from over about 40 years of activity across our network. So this is what it looked like before, zoomed in to an area of Texas. This is what we have today. I mean, that is transformational in our ability to bring precision to the conservation of imperiled species in our nation. So the MOBI analyses have allowed us to define a new unit of conservation, which we call areas of unprotected biodiversity importance, or ABIs, that are shown here in yellow. These are places with high probability of suitable habitat for imperiled species that have narrow geographic ranges that fall outside of our current protected area estate. So most of these areas represent habitat for more than one imperiled species, with an average of 5 co-occurring at any one of these yellow areas. So this map is a result of using decades of observation data combined with modern tools of spatial analysis to try to democratize precision conservation to prevent species extinctions. This is the kind of map that can support land trusts and private landowners, foresters and ranchers and farmers, federal and state agencies, to conserve that diversity of life that we were so lucky to inherit as a nation. And finally, I am wrapping up now. Finally, MOBI is not just a set of static map products. It's also a process. So this slide depicts this iterative dynamic process that we set up and that will continue to run and grow to continue to improve this data. So each of the species habitat models that underlies the map of biodiversity importance, it needs to be dynamic and updatable as new surveys are conducted and new occurrence records are obtained, as data on the climate or environment changes. Our modeling system needs to be accessible to the scientists all across the NatureServe network. So with a lot of support from Microsoft's AI for Earth program and also from Esri, we've built this dynamic, iterative modeling process in the Azure cloud. That cloud-based modeling system houses a library of over 250 terrestrial and freshwater environmental data sets that in this modeling are called predictor data. With support from an amazing team, Sean Breyer and his incredible team at the Living Atlas program, we've developed this library so that the environmental characteristics where a given imperiled species is known to occur can be really finely parsed, and to maximize our ability to capture that environmental envelope and those conditions that are the strongest drivers of a species distribution. And being sort of the data and standards people, our modeling process also captures metadata that supports the application of habitat models to management decision-making. So in partnership with several federal agencies, we recently published a framework for assessing model confidence at each step in the modeling process. And that metadata, which is generated every time a model is iterated, it produces an assessment for that specific model so that we can measure model confidence from the perspective of the users that are making decisions using models about species management. And finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, we've built a tool, a geospatial tool, that allows species experts and managers to engage with and inform and improve the model results. I mean, model outputs are they're just hypotheses that are spit out from a machine learning algorithm, right? Through this tool, a species expert can evaluate and annotate and revise that hypothesis. They can view the model outputs, add their own observation data, adjust thresholds, provide a review score on a 5-point scale, and annotate the model in various ways. And then all of their input is documented, and the model can then be rerun through that dynamic process so that this is an open and transparent and collaborative process, so that the end result, that distribution map, that critical data describing where species occurs, that happens with increasing precision and increasing confidence, keeps improving in an open and collaborative fashion over time. Okay, so wrapping it up and trying to weave it all together, right? There is no magic wand, as much as I wish there was, to sort of wave away the effects of biodiversity decline and global change. We have created a world in which the abundance and diversity of life that we depend on is diminished. While the seas are warming, rising and acidifying, where drought and wildfire and extreme events are increasing in frequency and intensity, we've turned into ecosystem engineers, and this is the world that we have created. And it's only through a combination of interventions will we face these challenges. So what are our directions? Protect what is left, restore what is degraded. We are ecosystem engineers, and we can be better at it, right? If those are the directions, protect what's left, restore what's degraded, that is a spatially explicit set of directions. We need to understand where. The science of where and the science of conservation are absolutely intertwined, because you want a world in which there is healthy habitat for magical species like seahorses. Of course, those of you who knew me knew I just had to fit a seahorse in somewhere, right? If the coastal oceans are healthy, then seahorses are thriving. And that means humans that depend on healthy oceans are thriving too. Being the right kind of ecosystem engineer does not need to be a lonely job. I want to close with this idea of networks, because I'm so just honored and grateful to be the chief scientist of such an amazing network as the one that NatureServe represents. What it means to get involved in engineering the future that we want, right? These challenges that we face in our communities and our societies, and even in humanity itself, these challenges can sometimes just be like simply and devastatingly overwhelming. But we have to recognize we live in a time with the most powerful, diverse, and creative toolkit to address those challenges that we've ever had, right? Data is pouring in across space and time. Computational capacity to make sense of that data is growing exponentially. And technology, just like it's doing right now, today, it can connect us into networks that allow us to solve our common problems in ways never before possible. So this slide is just to strongly encourage you to find the community that shares your passion and deepen your engagement towards those shared values. And if I've been the least bit successful this morning, I really hope those values now include a deepening of your commitment to conserving the diversity of life. Everyone on this call, everyone who will watch this presentation later, we are all part of a community that has a role to play in keeping our planetary web of life intact. So leverage that data, put technology to work for you, invest in and build your network of collaborative, like-minded solution finders. And along the way, you will discover the conservationist that has been inside of you all along. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Healy. That was an absolutely marvelous tour de force along so many fronts, beginning from the idea of how important biodiversity is to all of us, and how our planet has been shaped by the diversity of life in ways that we really have no idea, and you really brought that to life. That was so wonderful. And also the idea that spatial is special. And the answer to the many questions that you posed, those are largely spatial questions and with spatial solutions. And speaking of questions, oh my goodness. There have been so many fantastic questions coming in. I have barely been able to keep up in the moderation here, and I've tried to answer some of the basic logistical questions, but there are some really great substantive questions that I would like to now pose to you, Healy. We will not have nearly enough time to get to all of them. So maybe we can do a podcast or some other way to get to many of these questions. So if you can just take a deep breath after you have given such a fantastic presentation. We will take probably about the next 8 minutes because we only have 10 minutes left. And let me start with, there's one question that came in, and then another question that was related, and it's very interesting because the first question is one side of the coin, the second question is apparently the other side. So the first question is, do you believe individual action can help preserve biodiversity? And can restoring small pieces of private property play a role? Or are we better off supporting larger formal efforts that target especially valuable wild areas?
Thank you, Dawn. And I'm glad that we have engaged and mobilized audience here. So I guess my response back to the questioners is, why are these mutually exclusive, right? That we absolutely have opportunities as individuals at whatever scale, right? The 40 feet I have in my own backyard, I'm lucky enough to have a backyard. The window box I used to have in my grad student apartment in Berkeley that had a few pollinator-friendly plants just sitting outside my tiny little kitchen window box. I mean, that individual action, not only, yes, is it's important, and in fact, science has shown the value of, say, pollinator-friendly gardens planted in cities, where you would think an individual garden wouldn't make that much difference, but aggregated across even an urban environment, there's clear demonstrations of the value of, say, pollinator-friendly garden planting, even in tiny patches. So not only has that been demonstrated to be important for the conservation of biodiversity, but it's also important for your own sense of being connected to nature, for your own sense that you're actually doing what you can in some small way. That I can't underestimate how powerful I think that is at opening our eyes and continuing to motivate us to be engaged conservationists. Then the flip side really isn't the other side. It's just another strategy. And it's a different strategy, right? It's one where it's like, who are you working with? What are you, how are you contributing to large landscape conservation, which we absolutely know also from abundant science is an essential part of how we will conserve biodiversity in an era of global change at scale. And so both of those are important. And and I would not put them as either or. I would say that both are important. And anyone who wants to reach out to me to understand what their options are specifically in their area, I mean, I would love to point them to the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, which has a lot of efforts and really acts as a clearinghouse for many different organizations that are trying to bring conservation to scale. And then the City Nature Challenge is another fabulous opportunity to sort of look at the more urban, small scale opportunities that there are to invest in conservation.
Mm-hmm. That was a beautiful answer, Healy. And in the interest of time, I don't. The other question, I think you have touched on the other question already. We really only have time for one more question before we wrap up. And so I'll choose this question from a university student who wants to know whether NatureServe has internships for students.
We do have internships. I would say go to our website and check it out. There are not a whole lot. NatureServe, as the umbrella organization of the Natural Heritage Network, we're only about 50 or 60 people, but a powerful team. And we do sometimes have internships available. And in fact, I would like to call out a former NatureServe intern who should be on this call right now, Rashi Bhatt from India, who was absolutely essential in helping me do research and put this presentation together, and who began as an intern at NatureServe and will this fall start her PhD program in environmental justice at the University of San Francisco. So interns to PhD students all the way.
All right, fantastic. And Esri also offers paid summer internships as well. There are so many more questions that we're not going to get to. I'm going to do my best to try to answer them within the Slido platform. But we will be compiling these questions, and we will try to find a way to get answers out to this fantastic community. Healy, thank you so much again. Here for you is your award, which will be sent to you. This beautiful award thanking you. The least we can do is to thank you with such an award, and it will be sent to you. We'll put this in the mail tomorrow, along with another little surprise gift for you in huge gratitude for what you have given to us this morning.
Well, Dawn, it's very mutual. I mean, my biggest gift was that you wore your seahorse T-shirt. That's about as great a gift as I could ask for. And it's been our honor to be included in the GIS for Science Volume 3, for both Regan and I to have a chapter in the Women in GIS book. This has been an amazing opportunity to speak to this audience. I love the idea of a follow-up podcast, and thank you very much for this opportunity to feature this important topic at this venue.
Oh, terrific. And the questions are still coming in. Thank you to the audience for being so engaged, and clearly because of this tremendous presentation. I'm going to go back to sharing the screen here so that we can give you some launching points here. In fact, we can consider also continuing the discussion and putting some of these questions into Esri Community. That is what Esri Community is for. And we might set that up so that Healy could respond in those ways, because there were some general questions, but some that were very specific to the data sets, to the approaches that Healy mentioned described in her presentation. So the sciences community within Esri Community is at the link that you see on the screen. This is also within the slide deck that you can once again access via esriurl.com/symposium21. And we had a lot of people who missed out on the link to the special flip book, the GIS for Science flip book, that is about maps for saving the planet. That is go.esri.com/GIS-4-science-3. And once again, this is not something that you need to download. This is a book that is a flip book in your browser. And we are asking that you not spread this around, spread this beautiful secret link around. It is for you as a gift for attending our session in October. Around the October timeframe, the book will be completely polished and on sale and available in both print and e-copy. And we really look forward to having you enjoy it in that form as well. Also within the book, you'll find out how to get to the complimentary website, the complement, which has all of the digital resources. So we thank you so much again for making this event. For many of us, it is it's the favorite event of the UC. For those of us who are scientists, who identify with the scientific community, who are citizen or resident scientists, who love science. So thank you so very much again, and please enjoy all of the special interest groups today. Many of them are biodiversity conservation focused, and thank you so much for attending.